Hello, welcome to another Sunday Science Q&A. This one is a Trowelblazer special. You will find out more about that shortly. And also, just a quick question for everyone watching there. Have any of you had a glisclis in your house? You know, a glisclis, they're the also known as edible dormice, particularly amongst the ancient Romans who found them very edible. Anyway, they are extremely noisy and sound as big as a large rat, perhaps even the famous Vietnamese man-sized rat that they have in Coney Island, in one of the attractions there, which they say was more feared than a sniper's bullet. Sadly, that attraction was closed on the day I went to Coney Island. Anyway, we've got lots of questions and possibly some answers today on the Sunday Science Q&A. A few notes beforehand, just to remind you, if you can support us via Patreon, it's the begging bit at the beginning of all podcasts. That's the way it works. So if you can support us, that's fantastic. As you probably know, all live work basically doesn't really exist for the time being. I should currently have been on tour with my show, Satanic Rites for Robin Ince at the moment, but I'm not. Josie would have been on tour and various others. If you can support us, that's fantastic. We've got Patreon, various different ways you can support us via Patreon. We have less than 2% of people who watch and listen to our shows kind of in any way are able to financially support us. If we can get that up to 5% who are able to give us some patron support, that is absolutely fantastic. But obviously we will continue to make as much stuff that is free to access as possible, because I realise that some of you do not have any spare cash, so it's all fine. It all balances out in the end. Also, we've had another announcement on Wednesday. We announced, because 9 Lessons and Carols for Curious People is not going to be going ahead as a kind of long run theatrical run in London this year, we are, in some ways it's a better thing, because now it's accessible to you wherever you may be in the world. We're doing a 24-hour version of the 9 Lessons and Carols for Curious People. Many of the people you've seen on the Sunday Science Q&A will be there throughout that 24 hours. It will be live. I will actually be hosting it, probably from, as everything works out, from King's Place, with some live guests there as well. And then we'll be going around the world to people in America, in the US, in Canada, all over the shop, Norway, etc. And so far we've only announced a few of the guests, but we have got Ben Goldacre's going to be doing it, and Chris Hadfield's going to be doing it, and Helen Sharman's going to be doing it, and Sophie Ellis-Bextor's going to be doing it, and Mark Watson's going to be telling me how to do a 24-hour show, and Tanita Tickram's going to be there. Have I mentioned Brian Cox? Of course, you know, he'll be there. I just can't get rid of him. Brian Cox, CBE now. Yes, I'll have to have even more deference than I had for him last week. Also, a reminder, there's a tip jar at the bottom of this. If you want to ask any questions, then just go to Twitter at Cosmic Shambles. You can put the questions there, or you can put them in the chat box, and Trent will make sure, our producer, do say hello to him. He will make sure that I get any of the questions that you want to ask live. Also mention the science book Shambles, where there's a lot of trailblazing this week, because it is another trailblazer, Becky Ragg Sykes, who's written a really fantastic book called Kindred, all about our new and a rapidly advancing understanding of Neanderthals. And it's an absolutely fantastic book, and I talked to her about that, and that is going out on Tuesday. And you can also hear some of the previous ones. Paul Nurse, Nobel Prize winner Paul Nurse, Joe Marchant's lovely book about the human cosmos as well. I've talked about that. That's up this week. Finally, next week it's psychology and mental health on the Sunday Science Q&A, and our guests will include Dr. Dean Burnett and Professor Nav Cooper as well. Is going to be on as well. So if you want to start sending questions for that, don't put them in the chat box though. In fact, don't send questions till 4:00. It'll just get the whole thing confused. And then I'm going to ask a lot of paleontologists, archaeologists, and bubble physicists various different things about the amygdala and how that affects our day-to-day running. And we're not dealing with that today. Anyway, our guest today. Well, first of all, of course, not a guest, a regular friend and bubble advisor, Helen Czerski. Hello, Helen. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I'm very happy to be the Cosmic Shambles regular. That thing in the corner that doesn't seem to go away. It's still here. Really? One of those. People
like a gliss-gliss, like a gliss-gliss in the old fuse box.
Yes, but I don't go around tapping and scaring people in the middle of the night, at least not yet.
That's what you say. Yes. You probably use that telekinesis that the whole of science has been built around to deny its existence.
Yes, well, I come from the physics laboratory I did my PhD in has a Nobel Prize winner. It keeps a bit quiet about, because he sort of went down the telekinesis route after getting a Nobel Prize in physics for something very clever and very fundamental. Sort of couldn't deal with the publicity, and now thinks that telekinesis is a thing, and they're ever slightly embarrassed about him.
Well, who's that?
What's that?
Who's that? Which one's that?
Oh,
he's behind you.
It's more the because that's quite a common thing I've seen amongst physicists. I'm still waiting for it with Brian. That bit where I mean it's a thing, I suppose, in one way, where you see minds that have an incredible depth of understanding about one thing, but at the same time the brilliance of the mind can go into an area which seems, frankly, overly strange.
Well, I mean, it is one of those difficult things that we see in many areas of life, where once people get into the situation where no one really says no to them, so no one's really going to tell a Nobel Prize winner that they're wrong. And I think it's worse in other areas, but I suspect there was a little bit of that going on. Anyway, I've got a show and tell. Shall I not embarrass my old physics lab? I feel a bit bad because
take the show and tell using the power of your mind. That will be good.
Well, obviously you can't see what's going on around the screen, so you've got no idea how many things are floating around my room here. So anyway, my show and tell is a bit more of a question it raised in my mind, and I discovered that I couldn't find an answer. So I'm going to tell you about the question. So, in the nature of lockdown, we all walk around our flats, wherever we live, our houses, and we look at things maybe a little bit more closely than we normally do. So I was looking at this. Now, this whole thing, let me show you, is just a little paddle. So actually, I won this as a prize from my outrigger paddling club a few years ago. But it's not a real paddle that we would use. It's a ceremonial thing. But I was looking at the colours of the wood on here. Now, I think this is stained, but it made me go... Sorry, we've got 2-stage show and tell. It made me go and get my chessboard. Now, this is quite a nice chessboard. I bought it for myself as a present for finishing my PhD. And it's rosewood, and I can't actually remember what the light colour is. But... this is the genuine colour of the wood. We can really see that there is super dark wood and super light coloured wood. And so I went and had a nosy in the scientific literature this week, just out of curiosity to see how much we know about why wood is different colours. And the answer is we sort of know and we sort of don't. So there's lots of flavonoids and things like tannins in wood which are darker. It turns out that no one knows why ebony is black. This isn't ebony, but ebony, is famous for being this super black wood. Everyone thought it was something to do with iron and tannins, and people very confident said it's iron and tannins. And then they discovered there are no tannins in ebony. So there isn't a clear scientific answer on what makes ebony black. But the reason that I thought this was worth talking about is because as I dug around in the literature, different types of wood have all these different they're mostly flavonoids. They're useful things that are used for chemical messaging actually within the tree. Some of them have antifungal properties. They're all hanging around in different trees for different reasons. The reason people are studying them is to see whether they can breed trees that are different colours. And I thought that was such a lovely idea. And obviously there might be limits on the tree colour that you can get to. I don't think anyone is in the business of making blue trees anytime soon. But just the idea that, obviously all of these chemical messengers are, they're in the tree for a reason, but they obviously they're expressed from genes, right? There is a reason they're there. And so I just really like the idea of, all the mad things that people have tried to breed. I just really like the idea of people going poking about in the genetics of trees to see if they can breed a tree that's a different colour. And it might turn into a terrible idea, like those people that breed cats to try and make them look like tigers or something. I'm sure someone does that. But it was just, the chemistry of trees, it turns out, is really complicated. All the molecules that make wood this colour are functional. They do things within the tree. They carry things, they carry messengers, they keep out pests, and the colour is a side effect. But I just quite like the idea of coloured trees. So that's my show and tell.
That's lovely, and it's a beautiful chessboard. You deserved that treat for finishing your PhD. We're also joined evolutionary paleobiologist who has a new series on Channel 4, Bone Detectives, which you can see on Channel 4, I think, on Saturday nights. You can also obviously go on All 4 to catch up as well. And I've got a question for you before your show and tell, Tori. I have to ask this because on the walk that I had with my son today, he was telling me about one of his friends who said, when I was 5, he's 12 now. When I was 5, I was such a fool. I wanted to be a paleontologist, but now I realise, of course, I want to be a paleobiologist. That's the kind of foolishness that this particular friend of my son, he feels that at 5 he really had not thought it through. And then my son said, can you have as well as archaeologist and archaeobiologist? But I suppose you wouldn't. So these definitions, let's start off. Can you just tell me, paleobiologist, the divide between that and what would be considered to be paleontologist, if there is one?
I suppose it's more of a kind of focusing in terms of a subset of paleontology. But in general, paleontologists are all kind of interested in the biology of the animals they're looking at. I kind of vary. Sometimes I call myself a paleobiologist if I'm more wanting to talk about the biology questions. So using paleontology as a tool to answer questions that might otherwise be considered biological, like, how does evolution work? What are the mechanisms at play there? Or why is biodiversity in the world today the way it is, and the patterns we understand? In that sense, I would maybe phrase it as paleobiology to flag up the biology aspect of it all. But paleontology is basically the study of the past, like the entire past of life on Earth, by looking at extinct animals. And so if that's not biological, I don't know what is. So I'd say it's a specialism within it. People who tend to work on biological questions and use the fossil record as a tool rather than the other way around, studying it for its own right, maybe.
Right. So in terms of archaeology, is there, again, is that, would you say that archaeology is predominantly about the unearthing of human endeavors and is more rooted to Homo sapiens civilization in a broad sense?
So of course I would say that archaeology is a very minor subset of paleontology, but Susie might disagree with that one. I mean, it's interesting. So you'll come to Susie Birch in a second. Susie would describe herself, I think, as a zooarchaeologist or a archaeozoologist, is it either way around? And there's a fine line really there between what's a zooarchaeology and what's paleontology. And in many respects, all it really is that if you're a zooarchaeologist, you're tending to look at animals, particularly for their relationship to people. But of course, you end up crossing over. So I'm an Ice Age paleontologist, and in many sites there will be human presence, and at that point it becomes a very grey area as to what's going on. And again, it maybe depends on the focus of your questions, whether you're interested in purely or to understand the context of the human environment there, the human excavation element, you're excavating a human settlement of some kind and the animals inform you about humanity, or whether you're there to investigate, say, the animals and the environment, and humans are just a part of that ecosystem. And I think that it's interesting, and of course the line becomes less blurry as you go further back in time, and it's easier to sort of separate, say you have a few elements of material culture and no evidence of domestication. But where both Susie and I work, our research actually crosses over. We even collaborate because we kind of cross over at the end of our time ranges of interest.
And now let's find out, in terms of the time range of interest, your show and tell.
Me? Oh, right. Okay. So my show and tell, I'm actually going out of my comfort zone in terms of knowledge area to open up a broader issue here. And this is something I borrowed from my daughter. I did ask permission. She kind of looked at me a bit skeptically, because it's something very special that she found a couple of weekends ago on her 5th birthday. Now, she is a very lucky person. So let's see if I can get it in here and see if you can see it. Can you see what that is?
Lovely. Yeah.
Isn't that amazing? What a lucky girl she was, because there's always luck involved in fossil hunting, although you need sharp eyes too. Now, she found this on a beach in Dorset, and it's a pyritized ammonite. And I'm flagging this up here because even though this is probably somewhere between 100 and it's probably about 192 million years old, which is a long way out of my comfort zone. I get a bit iffy beyond about 3 million years ago. But yeah, this is here because I wanted to talk about not only the wonder of fossil hunting for children as a way to explore the natural world, and actually a way for anyone to. It's so exciting to spot something like this on the beach. I mean, look how pretty it is in and of itself, but also just how amazing it is that it's still there after all that time. But also because we were doing this just outside Lyme Regis, which is where a woman called Mary Anning is famously from, probably one of the most, if not the most famous historical paleontologists in the world. And I want to flag her up as part of the Trowelblazer mission. And Mary Anning has got quite an important, I think she means a lot to many paleontologists, particularly many women paleontologists, because she was this pioneer. I think she's a pioneer for women, a pioneer for working class outsider scientists everywhere, but also she is somebody who has carried the banner for those groups for a long time. And that's where Trowelblazers becomes interesting to me, and what we do at Trowelblazers there in relation to her story, because it's very easy to tell the story of Mary Anning as somebody who has been forgotten. Everyone always starts the story of Mary Anning as being this person, a pioneer who was forgotten or who was ignored, which is not the case at all. I don't think there's been a point in the last 200 odd years where people have forgotten Mary Anning. I mean, she was a celebrity in her own time. She was famous the world over. She knew it. There's a wonderful record of when the King of Saxony came to visit Lyme Regis, and he went to visit her fossil shop because it was one of the renowned fossil places to visit at that time. It was kind of part of the tour. And when they were there they were amazed by the specimens that she had. It was so wonderful. And his doctor, who was traveling with the King of Saxony, records in his journal of the trip that they asked for her signature, and she wrote it down, Mary Anning, and then she said, I am known throughout Europe like this. And it's basically, how can you not have heard of me before asking for my name, that kind of thing? Don't you know who I am? Because she was famous. She was famous in her own time. She was she was renowned. She was infamous in some ways. I mean, everyone loved telling stories about the latest crazy jape she got up to. There are letters between other scientists. I mean, the Philpott sisters, Elizabeth Philpott, wrote to Mary Buckland, telling all about Mary's latest scrape, going down to hunt for fossils and always getting run over by a cart, but not to worry, she was out there in the field again. And then, they're writing about her, talking about her. She's part of this bigger group, and she was famous then, and she continued to be famous the whole time through. And whenever people want to talk about paleontology, they often mention her. I suspect there are very few people who can name a male paleontologist from that time period, but who would probably recognise the name of Mary Anning. And she's that kind of celebrity status. But that doesn't change the fact that she was still an outsider scientist. Despite her fame, and despite the fact that we talk about her all the time, you can't get around the fact that she was poor. She was kind of a bit of a pet of all those more kind of refined upper class gentlemen and gentlewomen paleontologists. They like to have her in their area, but she never was really part of their league, not really. And I think maybe in some ways she's still a bit of a pet. We still talk about her as though she's this she's something we can wheel out to make a point. We've never really welcomed her into the fold, and that's always the case with the stories we tell to a certain degree, because the actual critical thing is that it wasn't just Mary who was doing paleontology at that time. I've already mentioned Elizabeth Philpott, who wrote to Mary Buckland, and at the same time, in Mary Anning's sort of world of experience and knowledge, there was another woman, Charlotte Murchison. And then just a few years later, not quite exactly the same time, but they were contemporaries, but never really crossed over, there was another woman called Barbara Hastings, who's often known as the jolly fast Marchioness, because she was a real gambler and a kind of like a lady who liked to party. But she was looking at hunting for fossils a bit further along the coast, down to sort of more around Portsmouth way. And so there were a lot of people out on the beaches hunting for fossils at the same time as Mary Anning was, not making a living out of it like she was. I mean, she was the first professional really to do that in a kind of way that really made a living, I think, for all these women. They were doing it because it was genteel and interesting, but they still made really important contributions to the development of the field. We don't remember any of their names. Okay, like I said, probably also most of us wouldn't have heard of Charlotte Murchison or even Roderick Murchison, or they wouldn't have heard of Mary Buckland, but also maybe not a William Buckland. And so it's not just the names that's the issue, it's more the idea of it. When you think of a geologist or a paleontologist from that period, your general idea is that it must have been a bloke, I think, right? But there are actually an awful lot of women out there contributing and taking part and looking for fossils, but we've forgotten that concept of them. And that was the reason why Susie, me, Becky and Brenna Hassett, who is the only Trailblazer you haven't got on this week, why we started Trailblazers, just to kind of tell all the stories in aggregate, to be basically to kind of like bombast, sort of blast these names at people, these faces at people, these images at people, so that when they looked at our website, you just scroll down and 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 just be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of contribution by women since the beginning of all of these fields. Because that's the critical thing. If you take a name like Mary Anning and you basically make her unique, you make her special, you talk about her as being forgotten, as being this thing that you're lifting up and putting into the limelight again, it gives people the opportunity to say things are different now. She was just a one-off, but now we're different, we're less prejudiced now. It's all going to be fine in a few years' time, because look at all the women coming through in their degrees, and it's not necessarily paying forward to professorship. It makes you want to say to them, how long do we have to wait? How long? Another 150 years? Another 200 years where you've forgotten all of these basic general contributions? Because if we forget in aggregate the whole contribution of a group of people to a field, if you rewrite your history in your mind by saying it was all done by white blokes, then you aren't necessarily properly appreciating just how bad the situation is in terms of diversity. And I think that's true across the board in many different areas of diversity as well. It's not about the names.
Tori, is there something here about accessibility? Because it strikes me, and maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I'm wrong on this, that one of the things about fossil hunting is that it's accessible to anyone. You don't need to have gone to the right university, you don't need to have gone to the right school, you don't really need to know the right people. And it shows that actually, if there's accessibility to the basics, then everyone can do well. And it highlights that it's the gateway that is the problem.
I think that's very, very true. I mean, that's a great thing about in many ways, about many field sciences. Access the kind of like the inner sphere of the kind of academic study of it, if you want to. I mean, it is interesting, as of course Mary, time-wise, and it's why she was so famous in her own time. It's because she was at a time when suddenly natural history became really cool. It was really fashionable, and people wanted to. It was the beginnings of these fields, the beginnings of geology, beginnings of paleontology. I have to say before I go on though, it gets really ridiculous. I mean, the level to which people will go to try and forget the concept, or to try to make the point that women weren't necessarily involved in these areas. And it's something that Susie turned up when we were very early on in the days of Trowelblazers, because we were trying to find images of women from that time. And it's not the easiest thing to do. And Susie turned up this amazing photograph by William Fox Talbot, one of the pioneers of photography. And she found it. She just typed in like women geologists, and she found it. And she found it on a photography site, and it's called The Geologist, this picture. And she found it, and underneath the caption said, correct me if I'm wrong, Susie, this picture originally contained a woman, but I've cropped her out because it was probably his mother. And it was called The Geologist. The Geologist. That's the first photograph of geologists, right? As a name, as a term, at the beginning of that field, the first photograph of them contained a woman, one man and one woman, and yet people were so convinced themselves so much that women weren't part of it that he actually cropped her out. Anyway.
Well, we will. There will be links under this to Trowelblazers, so people can anyone who doesn't know the site already can go and find out more. And also, we should say though, Brenna's is the only one not on this week. She was on 2 weeks ago, and as usual, she had some. Archaeological dental records to show us from some particularly grotesque teeth, which is always one of the things that she loves pulling out of that particular bag. Dr. Susie Birch, you've been mentioned already. You finished this particular quartet, and you are Associate Professor Anthropology and Geography at the University of Georgia. I'm going to get you straight into this then. Your show and tell.
Yes, well, my show and tell is actually also related to my research tangentially, I guess, but I actually brought a Muntjac skull here. Just hold it up, so you can see the very distinctive canines. And I think this is a species of deer that's familiar to most people in the UK, and maybe not so much in the US. But I did my PhD at Cambridge, and so I was living in England for a few years there, and we used to have one in our back garden that would be a regular visitor. And I love this species because I think it's really interesting, being that it's aberrant, being a deer with fangs. You don't think of deer with fangs very often. And but I also like it because it represents, again, the role of humans in shaping and affecting the natural world, being that it is an invasive species that was brought to the island and is actually more common than any native deer species. And that's something that people have been doing for thousands of years. So we've seen it with several different kinds of wild animals, like fallow deer as well, throughout Europe, but also most of our domesticated species, which is what I work on. I look at the initial domestication and then spread of domestic species throughout Europe. And so it's just a fun kind of specimen that I have to remind me of those sorts of things.
It's a very large skull as well, isn't it, for a Muntjac? That's a full adult, I presume.
Yes, yeah. And male too. So females. Then?
What's with the fangs? Why has it got fangs?
So that's the thing that makes it such an interesting adaptation, because they're, traditionally, obviously deer, they usually have much larger antlers, and they're using those, the males, to compete for access to females. So their, antlers tend to be obviously more robust the older the animal is. He's fought several generations, and he's proven he's virile and everything. But in the Muntjac, they're greatly reduced. They're almost, they're these tiny little things. And it's actually the canines that they use to symbolize, to sort of fight and show their superiority over other males. So they're actually for mating purposes, and they're not.
These for mating.
Yes.
That sounds aggressive for everyone concerned.
Well, last time she had one of the skulls of a BG, and there were much the same things said about that as well. Can I just ask, because I was brought up in Hertfordshire, and there were a lot of Muntjac around there, and I was always told, but this might be wrong, that the reason there was because many of them had escaped from Whipsnade Zoo, which isn't that far away. So where did the introduction begin, which has now led to them being in the wild?
the source. There was a sort of so-called escape. There was a single introduction event, from what I understand, and then the population grew from there.
And how long ago was this?
That I'm not sure.
Very recent. It sounds very recent.
Yeah. It's the last few decades, I would say. Maybe early. Yeah, I don't know.
I would answer that because my dad told me when I was growing up, but he also told me that all guardsmen at Buckingham Palace had pigeon-toed feet. So I don't trust him. So I'm not going to bother answering that question. Let's get straight into. We've got lots of questions from. Let's start off with something that a megafauna question. So everyone, chip in, whoever wishes to. I'll start with you, Susie. This is from Poetic Polymath. Along with Megatherium, moa, and massive Australian marsupials, what are the most interesting of the extinct Quaternaria megafauna?
Oh, well, for me, I mean, I guess I would give it more of a personal rather than professional response, because that's sort of, I'm working more at the tail end of that. They've sort of all died off right around when I'm picking up. So my favorite would probably be, I'd have to say, Smilodon, saber-toothed tiger in North America. And that's just a sort of childhood. I distinctively remember, in third grade or something like that, having to write an essay if you could be any animal. And I chose going back in time and being a Smilodon. So I think part of that was actually because I wanted to go back and see everybody, but I didn't want to worry about being eaten, So I was like, this is a good choice. I'll just be at the top of the food chain and I can observe the mammoth and the giant beaver and so on.
That's why Susie's, and she's been successful ever since.
Yeah, that's right. I take the Smilodon approach.
But there's that strange thing, isn't it, that when we see images of extinct animals, we go, wow, wouldn't it be amazing to be in a world where they existed? And we can then be very blasé about some of the, equally absurd and magnificent looking creatures. There's a strange thing that happens once you see something is part of an archaeological or paleontological record rather than something that exists now.
Actually a little understudied in terms of thinking about the later sort of Paleolithic and end of the last ice age. We think a lot of times about humans struggling against the environment, overcoming, sort of the glacial conditions and so on. But there was also a lot of predators to be concerned about. And we had, things like hyenas and cave lions and cave bears to be concerned about as well. And thinking about human kind of predator interactions, something I think doesn't get enough research, really.
That blasé thing is a really interesting point, because I think that's definitely maybe a perspective from people who live in a country that's already really, really, really impoverished in terms of its animals, its fauna. So coming from a place like the UK in particular, so that's we're at the tail end of a lot of extinction. So a lot of our big scary animals have been driven to extinction by the fact that humans have been here in large numbers for quite a long time, and we still get a real sense of wonder, from watching nature documentaries, or if you're lucky enough to get to go somewhere where you come face to face with a big animal. But you don't really appreciate, I think, what it feels like to live in the midst of such incredible richness and diversity from our perspective. It's just a kind of a voyeuristic thing. It's something we're part of and separate from. And I don't know, it's that idea of shifting baselines, isn't it? We don't know what we've lost necessarily because we've never experienced it. But I remember really vividly it was really my first experience traveling abroad. I had one tiny trip with my family. We didn't do foreign holidays or anything. That wasn't possible. But in my undergraduate, I organised an expedition to go to French Guiana, and we spent the summer there, like sort of 3 months over the sort of 2.5 months over the summer in the jungle. And the guy we worked with there, who was like a young French Guianan, and he was convinced, he was really sure that we must be so sad, and he was so sorry for us living in a place like Britain where there was nothing wonderful to look at, nothing. And he was so angry and so worried about the potential impact of deforestation on his forest as he saw it, because he just couldn't even contemplate the sadness and the trauma of turning his country into something as boring as Britain, like that. And
there's also this thing, though, isn't there, which is that we spend a lot of time pushing wildlife out. People go, oh, it's terrible, we haven't got any beavers left or whatever it is. If you show them a spider, the thing most people want to do is get rid of it as quickly as physically possible. And there's a sort of sanitization of it. And I feel a lot of this is actually about, I'm not saying we should all live with spiders everywhere. I don't mind.
I am.
But it's like, if you see a spider, go, oh, it's a cool spider, right? That is a cool thing that you've got, rather than trying to push it away, concrete over it, cover it up, hide it. There's a sort of, we've done very well in the modern world of engineering ourselves to be separate to nature. And I think part of appreciating what we could have and what we maybe had is just allowing ourselves to get a bit closer to it, clearly within the regions of not spreading disease or whatever it is. Not that spiders do, as far as I know. But, it's that we've put so much effort into pushing it away. It's actually quite a big shift. And what I find, you work in those places where there is a lot more beautiful wildlife, is that people it's not an us and them thing. They don't go, it's over there. And I think that's also part of the thing with the looking at, animals from the past and what animal would you be and that kind of thing. It's like, it's safe because it's over there. You don't have to go and get your feet dirty and get a leech on your calf and all of those things. And that's the thing about the nature documentaries, is you can sort of see it all and you can go, oh, isn't it wonderful? But you don't have to be tired and cold and covered in mud.
Yeah, or just the actual sense of real fear that you get from being up close to something which is huge, like an elephant. You can love and think they're cute in a nature documentary, but they're actually freaking scary. Yeah. And similarly, like if you, I was really lucky to I saw a tiger when I was in India, and oh my God, I have never ever in my life experienced that feeling of prey as I did then. I just really realized where I was in the world, because it was just extraordinary and very, very visceral. But I keep thinking about you, Robin, and your gliss. I mean, you've got to listen to what Helen's saying there. So in that sense, it's true. I mean, and we do have to live alongside animals, and they make our lives difficult. And that's one of the big tensions in the world. And I'd actually slightly disagree with what you said there, Helen. I think a lot of people who do live in places where there are dangerous snakes and dangerous spiders and big predators spend a lot of time trying to push them out of their lives. Yeah.
but I kind of meant that they're not as they do push, but it's not a sort of, it's not an us and them thing. They just don't want that bit of us to come over here.
Maybe. Whereas, I don't know. There's a lot of effort that goes into. I mean, and like for instance, Asian elephants massively endangered, much more endangered than the African elephant. But humans and elephants do not mix very well, and an awful lot of effort goes into keeping elephants out of crops. And I think a lot of people living alongside, who have an elephant herd which kind of has a route through their territory, would probably be pretty happy if they were all just got rid of. And that's because it's that personal feeling about it. When it directly impacts on your life and livelihood, then a lot of highfalutin ideas about saving biodiversity go out the window. And again, maybe that's the flip side of our separation from it when you're sitting outside of it, or you can be a bit more cerebral about it all.
Well, if anyone watching, if you have any unwanted spiders that are wandering around your house, we'll be giving out Helen's address afterwards, and you can send them directly to her. This is from Michael, age 6. Hello, Michael. This is Michael would like to know. I'll start with you, Susie. Michael would like to know, how do you know how old bones are?
That's a great for us as well, working in the last the later bit of the Quaternary, the last 50,000 years. Radiocarbon dating is really the gold standard, and essentially the way that works is there's let's see how to put it sort of very simply, that there's radiocarbon everywhere, and when we're alive, everything alive is sort of taking up this radiocarbon, so plants and animals, humans too. And then when we die, we stop absorbing this radiocarbon and it starts to decay. And it decays at a known rate. That's what's really important. So every approximately 5,700 years, there's half the amount of the original radiocarbon left. So yeah, at 5,700 years, there's half. And then another, when you're at almost 12,000 years, there's another half of that, right? And so on and so forth. So this works, pretty well for us to measure then the radiocarbon in the bones, or in, plants as well. So if we have wood or something like that, and we can then use our knowledge of the rate that happens at to calculate how old something is. And when we first started doing this, the science was very new. People couldn't go back very far because we couldn't detect these lower and lower ratios of carbon. But now with the modern instruments that we have, we can get back to about 50,000 years of time. So that's really, I would say, the main way that we can tell. But of course, if we don't have the ability to radiocarbon date something, or if it's past that 50,000 year mark, then we have to start using other methods.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that question. And Tori, I'm going to ask you now, which one should we have? There's a lot of we've got a lot of mammoth-based questions, by the way. I'm just going to warn you, just so you know. We're going to start off with Jenny's
Always
question,
mammoth.
though. Before we go back, we're going to have one more human-based question, which is Jenny would like to know, how do we determine ages of people/civilization? She's talking about she's watching on Bone Detectives. There was a talk of the Beaker people and very specific times there. So how do you determine that?
That is slightly outside my wheelhouse in terms of sort of the broader question of how archaeologists go about it. For instance, that Bone Detective episode, we could radiocarbon date, and the bones were radiocarbon dated, so that gave you a nice age. And similarly, you can date pots that have been when they've been fired, and there are aspects of that. You can place an absolute chronology onto it. There's the bigger question in archaeology where these periods were worked out before people had access to radiocarbon dating. So that's a phenomenon of really the last 40 years or so in terms of it being used properly, and probably actually only in the last 10, 20 years where it's got really, really accurate. So before then, we had this idea of sequences, and that was mostly done on the basis of shared culture. And that got very interesting. So you'd look at, say, the sort of types of things that were found with people, and using methods like stratigraphy. So, let's say you had a nice little section in an archaeological dig, and at the bottom you'd have a certain kind of pot that looked one way, and then as you went up, the types of pot changed. They could order those and say, see changes in the material culture and the objects people had with them that you could then associate with sort of different cultural groups, maybe. And that created sort of an idea of building a kind of timeline, a kind of chronology based on culture. And of course, the issues there become quite complicated, because how do you know whether, if you've kind of tied your culture to your timeline, how do you know when cultures move around? How do you get that kind of sort of independent verification of movement? And that's where some of the really hottest topics of what's going on in archaeology have come from. What's going on? Had the pots moved? Had the people moved? Have cultures come together? Have we seen a change in culture in one area that's spread elsewhere? Those kind of finer details are starting to be unpicked by trying to get independent dating, like radiocarbon dating, or independent evidence from the genetics that are starting to sort of change our understandings of that. And the Beaker question is exactly one of those problems. For ages and ages and ages, there was a debate which basically was, do the pots move? These amazing beakers, which is where the beaker culture comes from. Did the pots just move? Did people just kind of ship their pots around because they were kind of cool pots? Or did people actually bring the pots with them? And the ancient DNA evidence is now showing that people did move, but there's actually a kind of almost like a beaker culture a beaker culture came from one end, but then people picked it up from somewhere else and moved it through. And it's a very still complicated and controversial topic. But it's great that we've now got these different methods coming together that can challenge assumptions and also move the field on, I think.
Brilliant.
I have to say, I used sort of in my undergrad confused at first, because I thought that I was so what was wrong with me, because I was always troubled by the fact that it was like the Bronze Age, in Turkey is not the same as the Bronze Age in Germany or in England, and there must be something wrong with me that I'm not, kind of comprehending the actual dates with the periods. And then I realized, oh no, it's because, it happens at different times in different places. It's okay. It's not me, it's the archaeology, and so I had to come to accept that. And that's, that is a really big tension, I think, in the field. And it is a really active area of research, especially now because radiocarbon dating is, so well refined. We just got a new calibration curve out this year. That was the big news. To better understand and refine our dates. And so I think going forward, there's a lot of research and kind of going back to these older chronologies from the last 100 years and these ideas of cultural change, and actually looking at the timings and how they match up, everywhere.
And it's really, Helen, I thought you should contribute here, because you do a lot of work on radioisotopes and things like that as well, don't you? I'm sure that crosses over with your stuff in oceanography.
So we do and we don't. So one of the things that is interesting, actually, I was going to say about the radiocarbon isotopes is that we can not only use them to date objects, but we can use them to trace movement. Because actually in modern oceanography, we're not necessarily using ancient isotopes, old isotopes, the sort of, thousands of years. But there was a really interesting event that sort of I don't think humans should do this again, but it was very useful. And that is all the nuclear weapons tests in the 50s. And basically what that meant is it's called bomb carbon. So basically it created this huge pulse of carbon-14 in the atmosphere, just in general. So everything that we've been talking about has to do with ratios, right? You have all these carbon atoms, you count up how many are carbon-14, you count up how many are carbon-12, and it's the ratio between the two that matters. And in the 1950s, all these nuclear weapons tests basically put a great big spike of carbon-14 into the atmosphere. And that has turned out to be spectacularly useful, because what we can do, for example, so in the North Atlantic Ocean, there's carbon is taken up in the North Atlantic and it's carried down into the deep, and it kind of slides down into the deep ocean like this. And there's a question, well, how fast is it going there? And you can actually see, because there's a kind of shape, if you draw the carbon isotopes, you can actually see that this is where it's got to since 1950, that in 1950 that bit was up there, and you can measure that it goes at 11 centimeters a day or something like that. I can't remember. They're really slow currents. So isotopes are useful for all kinds of things. It's not just dating bones, but we can actually trace back where water's been, where ancient atmospheres have been, using all of that.
Yeah, that 1950s bomb spike is basic day. So when you say something in radiocarbon dating is like, I don't know, 1,000 years before present, well, that actually means 1,000 years before 1950 because of the bomb spike. So that is literally the present is, if you like, so BP as opposed to before Christ, but BP is before bomb spike, which is interesting. You've got one hand, like you've got the common era, like defined by Jesus Christ, and then you've got our era, present, defined by a bomb spike.
There's a sequence in Beneath the Planet of the Apes, which in some ways also refers to that, though I think is less scientifically accurate. This is for everyone here from Anonymous. Is cloning mammoths as a food source a stupid idea? Susie, starting with you.
Oh, I don't know. That's really more of a Tori. Yes, that's more of a Tori question. Personally, I'm not too interested in eating mammoth meat myself.
Come on.
Sorry.
I don't think it would taste very good. I don't think it would taste
surely,
very good.
I mean, surely the question is how much do they belch and fart? That is the one of the defining problems with modern meat supply.
Methane, right? Yeah.
Although, yeah, I did visit a place in Alabama where they were cloning. They were basically taking genes from fertilizing eggs and making fertilized eggs and sperm. Slightly convoluted process to do it from a dead animal, and then implanting it in a surrogate of something similar, and then trying to this thing, in some species you can get that to give birth, and they were doing it in cats. So they had a wild cat, they could implant this embryo in a domestic cat. It produced the most miserable kitten I've ever seen. There's all kinds of ethical problems with doing this, but they were also trying to do it with lions and tigers. So if you were going to do this, you would probably have to implant the mammoth in an elephant. I'm not sure, this is not a good idea. All the gut bacteria, the microbiome that would normally go, the culture, all of that, you're just creating this thing that doesn't have any of that. But the problem is you probably could do it if you really wanted to, and that probably means that some really rich person is going to do it because then they've got one in their zoo. And I think with a mammoth it might actually be possible. There's probably enough DNA, it's recent enough if someone really wanted to, but I really don't think it's a good idea. Never mind, I mean, I'd quite like to see a mammoth, in the if you could go back with a special telescope into the past kind of thing. I would love to see a mammoth, just like I'd love to see a giant moa. But I think the ethics of doing it, just from an animal welfare point of view, are so. Just imagine a creature, all creatures, most mammals are very attached to their mother when they are born, right? That's a really important thing. And if you create an animal which not only is a different species but hasn't got any, they basically will eat each other given the chance. The animal welfare consequences of that alone are horrific. So I think it's not problem free for several reasons.
There's several steps in this question. I mean, the question was, is it a stupid idea to clone them for food? And I guess I would personally say it's kind of a stupid idea to clone them full stop. But, at the end of that, this sort of the step down the line is for food alone. I mean, they were clearly quite tasty. Elephant is pretty delicious. There's various elephant hunting cultures, and you tend to go for the really high value aspects of the animal, because obviously it can feed a lot of people. One elephant can feed a lot of people for a long time. But there are particular bits of it that are very, very, very sort of fatty, like the trunk, the brain, the foot. The feet of elephants have got these amazing foot pads. So if you were to see the bone of an elephant foot, it would look like a sort of a person wearing stilettos. So it's actually on tippy toes. It's got a flat foot like this, but the actual bones are like that, and there's a cartilage and a strut that comes here, and then here's like a wedge of fat, and that foot pad is really like a high value piece of nutrient. I imagine that the average Western consumer would want mammoth steak. They would be so into mammoth foot pad maybe, but yeah, I mean, I don't think it's if you're this is the stupid bit I'm trying to think about. If you're after a kind of a sustainable food source, a cloned mammoth would not be the best meat one, I suspect. And then, as Helen says, there's all the ethics of it all. I mean, so it's true. I mean, right now there are two different ways that people are trying to clone mammoths, clone in inverted commas. There's a group called Suam in South Korea who are supposedly looking into cloning a mammoth using viable mammoth cells. So taking a kind of a whole mammoth cell and popping it into like an Asian elephant egg and then zapping it, as they do for dog cloning, and then popping that into a surrogate. The other approach is to use CRISPR, and as a group at MIT in George Church's lab, I think, he's MIT Harvard crossover, and they are also supposedly looking into tweaking the mammoth genome to make it the elephant genome to make it a bit more mammothy. So looking at sort of tweaking things associated with hairiness and fat and things like that, and cold ability. So different kind of hemoglobin. And mammoths had different hemoglobin, so they could absorb oxygen at cold temperatures. It's quite hard to absorb oxygen at cold temperatures. So little things like that to kind of make them more adapted to living in the high Arctic. And that, they say their justification for that is sort of threefold. So there are three reasons for doing it. They think it's worthwhile doing. First is it's a way of restoring to the ecosystem in the high Arctic a piece of megafauna, a very important keystone species, the mammoth, which they believe, a number of people believe actually, including some people called the Zimovs who run a place called Pleistocene Park in Siberia, that if they had mammoths, then the ecology, the environment of the permafrost area would be less full of trees, and it'd be much more open. There wouldn't be so many dwarf shrubs, like dwarf willow, dwarf alder. There'd be a lot more grass, and that would result in a more stable permafrost that was more resistant to warming in a warming world. The second reason is to bring back, in inverted commas, an animal that was driven to extinction, they think, by humans. I mean, I'm jury's out a bit on that one still, I'd say, from my point of view. Third one is as a way of kind of increasing the number of Asian elephants in the world. So as a kind of conservation of the genetics of Asian elephants, a kind of brand new species, a kind of hybrid elephant mammoth. So by doing that, by allowing elephants to live in the high Arctic, you increase the potential areas that elephants could live in, and therefore maybe keep their genes going, if not the species, if Asian elephants go extinct in India and the parts of Asia they're still left. So that's their reasons for it. But again, you still need a surrogate. So George Church has talked a lot about using fake artificial wombs. They haven't been invented yet, so that's a way down the line. So if you were to do it in any timely fashion to maybe get your permafrost stabilization kick in a time period where you could, before it was too late, you'd need to use a surrogate. And the ethics there are problematic. Elephants are highly social. They don't do well in captivity, full stop. So any kind of captive Asian elephant is usually a miserable elephant. Secondly, there's about 6 million years of evolution between a mammoth and an Asian elephant. So that's about the same as between you and me and a chimpanzee. So the idea of me carrying a chimp to term as a surrogate, that gives you a sense of how risky it would potentially be for the surrogate mum of the elephant. And if it was born, there's no guarantee that the baby mammoth would survive. And in that sense, it's kind of sad. The investment, the trauma to the surrogate, is it worth it? We just don't know. So you have to decide, are the reasons for doing it, do they justify the experimentation? And I would say right now, no, they do not. There was one example of a hybrid African Asian elephant baby. It didn't survive, so that gives you a sense.
One thing that I wonder about is the ecological, the sort of the ecological argument of the tundra, the permafrost environment, because I do wonder how legitimate that argument is, since they have been extinct already so long. Is sort of the time for that threshold passed? Would it actually make a difference? That's what I wonder about.
Yeah. You'd also just put some elephants up there with a woolly coat on if you wanted to. So
there we go. The mammoth merkin is what's being looked at there. And by the way, if any of you do want to see a particularly grotesque film involving the eating of an elephant, you can watch Jodorowsky's Sante Sangre, which is a thriller about a circus knife throw, which has a particularly bizarre elephant funeral scene. Really? There we go. That's my recommendation to you. Now we've got about 15 questions left. We have 7 minutes to go. Let's see how many we can get through. Oh, brilliant. An ethics question. So I imagine this one will take less than a minute. This from V-Fish. Ethics question more than a science one. How do you feel about researching remains of ancient civilizations? And that is obviously a problem. And V-Fish mentions things like, burial sites, etc. Talking to Rebecca Rag Sites last week, even talking about things like Neanderthal burial sites. How much does that change the way that you approach those sites? Do you want to start on?
Well, sure. I think, in general, sort of saying the study of human civilizations ethically, I don't see an issue, with that. I think that it's a separate question in terms of human remains specifically. A lot of that really depends on the existence and the role of descendant communities and what their feelings are on the matter. I think there's huge variation. Personally, I'm an American, but I work in Eastern Europe and the Near East, and working in the last 10,000 years, there's some connection, and but there's not necessarily cultural continuity, between who these people were and the current population, and there's not necessarily the situation that we do see in North America, where we have native indigenous American populations who have been disenfranchised through colonization. Who there has been a legacy, there's been a history of really problematic interaction with archaeology. And so I think it really matters, where you are and how, and in those cases, right, a lot of times there are direct links between the people living today and the people whose archaeology is sort of, at stake. And so I think it really, it varies, it's one of those, it depends kind of cop-outs maybe, but so I think that any archaeologist, wherever they do choose to work, needs to be very aware of those issues when they're working with human remains. And I think in some cases it is a problem, and in some places it's not. In some cases it's not. So personally, I prefer to work with animal bones, so I don't have to feel sort of bad about. That was one of the things when I first started getting into archaeology. I realized I didn't really like working with human remains too much. Too morbid for me.
There's
so
something
I stick to the dead animals. I stick to the dead animals.
Sarah Parkak was saying that when she was on a while ago about the fact that she now finds that when she's an archaeologist, known great book about space archaeology, which is the view of terrestrial archaeology from space, not the Martian civilizations that have been kept secret by the government, obviously. And it is, but she said that her sensation that the older she's got, when she holds the skull of a child, that the connection to it, and I think that's an interesting thing, Tori, I don't know, which is if we don't have enough reverence to some of these importance for these important sites and that connection, then some of the meaning is lost if it merely becomes an object of.
Also, you shouldn't and ever. I think you should ever actually try and remove yourself or your emotions from it, because if you do that, then or you think you've done that, then you maybe make the error of thinking you're objective when you never really are. And we always look at these remains and these past civilizations through the lens of our own cultural bias, and how we interpret them is always affected by that. And it's good to be aware, I think, of one's emotional response to things, so that you can potentially guard against making assumptions about a past culture that is basically based on what you think is normal. I'm trying to make, do you think that the question is coming down to, is it okay to disturb any ancient grave because that person was buried with the desire that it stayed where it was effectively? And I would say I don't know, that's a kind of interesting kind of bigger point. And I find, as Susie said, if there's no connection, then I personally feel that my curiosity is kind of overrides that. If there's no current person who it actually matters to, then that would be how I feel about it. And I think the most important thing to do in that case is, as you say, to bring reverence to it and to value it. And the value comes from the information it passes on, but also the value that every human person has. It's just there.
So two very quick things, because we are running far over the 30 seconds per thing for the question. One is that there are much more interesting cases where studying the past might help disease today. So for example, studying plague victims might have medical benefits today, and there's a whole other set of ethics there. But the other thing, the major point, is that you have your discussions before you do it and not afterwards. And that's the biggest single thing, I think. And those discussions have to involve a lot of people and actually be serious and include the possibility you don't do it, rather than being a nod to, oh, well, we're going to have our little chat and then we're going to do it anyway. But that's
and the other thing is, of course, is so for instance, I'm not an archaeologist, but presenting bone detectors, a lot of the sites that have been worked on are sites of burial sites that have been uncovered because things are being built. And so archaeologists are brought in then to remove the human remains, because human remains are seen to be special. And so they're excavated carefully and with respect. And part of that respect is doing a really good job to understand those people. Otherwise, they could just go in the bin. And so, so in that sense, there's an ethical responsibility as a person to do it well and to do it properly. And I think it's really great that our planning regulations require that. I think that is part of the ethics of building, if you like. The ethics of construction is to value the things you are building on, and to value the history and value the past. And I've not met a single archaeologist that doesn't do anything other than treat human remains with incredible respect. And they're always moved by them. They always are. Even if they've handled hundreds and thousands of skeletons, they're always moved by the people that they've worked on.
I was an interesting thing talking to an archaeologist who said that very often sacred sites can be a palimpsest. So in cities, you actually discover that the contemporary temple was built on whatever the previous religion was. And if you go further down, and very often when they're doing excavations or just kind of mending the pipes, you suddenly go, this was still a sacred place. It was for a different religion, the sacred place. And I think that palimpsest at building of civilization is a very beautiful kind of vision as well.
Yeah, one of the things I've really learned from just dipping my toes into the water of archaeology has been how people value their ancestors, real or imagined, if that makes sense. So there's so many examples of ritual sites that get reused, where people come back to places that a previous earlier culture has valued, and it's either because there's something in the landscape that's important to everybody, or because there is evidence of previous people there, and that's really powerful to people. And so you get early Bronze Age barrows being used by late Bronze Age people as kind of sacred sites, and you see early Bronze Age people using Neolithic sites, standing stones, as places of power and importance. And so people are responding to the previous cultures that were there and valuing them, and valuing that sense of continuity, even though it might be not a true genetic continuity or a cultural continuity, but they're incorporating it into their own systems and beliefs. Then you see it, of course, in high resolution in the historical period, where you see mosques used as churches and things like that. People reuse important and powerful sites for people because there's a purpose. It has an importance to all kinds of cultural aspects of life, whether it's incorporating an old belief into a new belief to your own advantage, or whether it's just because you respond to the idea of people being there before you.
Well, it's about identity, isn't it? And so one of the great things, so I'm a trustee of Royal Museums Greenwich. One of the great things the director there says about the museum is that this is where we hold the memories. And we don't tell you what to think about them if we do the job well. We allow people to come to it and bring their, the parts of their identity that relate to this object. But the museum is kind of holding the memory for everyone, so they know it's there, so they can go back and visit that part of their identity. And then everyone can discuss which part of their identity and how they get different parts of their identity from that same object. And I think that's a really nice thing to consider, that you do, as Tori said, if you don't want these things to end up in the bin, so someone needs to hold the memory, and that is also a part of the ethics. Do you want to hold the memory so that people can visit it and continue to discuss it and continue to examine their own identity through it?
Susie, you look like, sorry, yeah.
Yes. Well, I was going to say, just further back in time we go, we have less remains, we have less knowledge and understanding of the lives that those individuals lived. And they can be representatives, right, of a population, of a lost group of people. And so I also think that's really incredibly important to consider that as their legacy. They're having another life, sort of beyond the grave, by telling us more about, themselves and the other people. So, many times working in caves, sort of, again, this end of the last ice age, 15,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, we don't have as many human remains as much later in time. And so every individual is actually really, really important. And I think also can serve, again, a reflection of this kind of identity where, what does that mean to us now, to people anywhere, not just people living in that local area, the further back in time we go, because it's telling us about our shared kind of heritage.
Brilliant. Thank you, all of you. By the way, today's episode has now taken the record. The theoretical physicists used to have the record for the fewest questions in an hour. That has now been trumped by you. And that was there's so many interesting things there, and there are Mark. By the way, I promise I'll ask Helen your question about desalination next week. There's lots of other stuff that we'll hold over, and next time we do a similar panel, we'll still have these questions, and we'll go through those. Just a reminder, if you can support us via Patreon, or if you leave something in the tip jar, that is fantastic. And the 12th of December is the day to put in your diary for the fact that we will have, we're going to do a 24-hour live show. We've got Chris Hadfield, Helen Sharman, Brian Cox, Sophie Ellis-Bextor, loads of other people as well, and they're going to be announced continually. So go to the Cosmic Shambles site to find more about that. Also, very soon I'll tell you news of a new series that we're doing for our Patreon supporters, which includes people like Stuart Lee and Alan Moore, doing which I'm thoroughly enjoying making this series at the moment. And as I said, if you're a Patreon supporter, you will find out all about this very, very soon. Thank you, Tori. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Susie. And thank you to our producer, Trent Burton. We'll be back next week. As I said, if you can start sending them in now, we're going to be dealing with different questions about mental health. See you next Sunday at 3 p.m.